We gather here in Jesus' name. His love is burning in our hearts like living flame. For through the loving Son, the Father makes us one. Come take the bread, come drink the wine, come share the Lord. No one is a stranger here, everyone belongs. Finding our forgiveness here, we in turn forgive all wrongs. He joins us here, he breaks the bread. The Lord who pours the cup is risen from the dead. The one we love the most is now our gracious host. Come take the bread, come drink the wine, come share the Lord. We are now a family of which the Lord is head. Though unseen, he meets us here in the breaking of the bread. We'll gather soon where angels sing. We'll see the glory of our Lord and coming King. Now we anticipate the feast for which we wait. Come take the bread, come drink the wine, come share the Lord. Come take the bread, come drink the wine, come share the Lord.
Let us sing for joy to the
Once I stood in the night with my head bowed low, in the darkness as black as could be, and my heart felt alone, and I cried, "Oh Lord, don't hide your face from me. Hold my hand all the way, every hour, every day, from here to the great unknown. Take my hand, let me stand where no one stands alone. Like a king I may live in a palace so tall, with great riches to call my own. But I don't know a thing in this whole wide world that's worse than being alone. Hold my hand all the way, and strength to the Lord of Lords. Power and strength to the Lord of Lords. Glory to the King of Kings. Majesty, power and strength to the Lord of Lords. Glory to the King of Kings. Majesty, power and strength to the Lord of Lords. Holy One, all creation crowns you King of Kings. Holy One, King of Kings, Lord of Lords. Holy One, glory to the King of Kings.
They're starting. They're starting. They're realizing. If I keep talking, eventually the important ones will realize. All right, we're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 18 this morning. 1 Samuel 18. Last time we finished off chapter 16 and talked about chapter 17, so the rise of David as the new anointed. We saw him being chosen out of his brothers. We saw and discussed the transition of the Spirit of the Lord coming from Saul to David, and then the Spirit had to be replaced, and so a harmful spirit or an evil spirit from the Lord replaced the Spirit of the Lord in Saul. Saw a little bit of how that interacted. And David's response to it, that David is brought in to be the soother. At that point, it seems like they don't quite know each other. They don't quite know what's going on. In chapter 17 was David and Goliath. We saw the armies of the Israelites and the Philistines gathered together. The two of them are having skirmishes, but no real decisive battles. Each time before the skirmishes, the champion of the Philistines, Goliath, he comes out. And ultimately, David is the only one to be brave enough to challenge him, or foolish enough to challenge him, or have faith enough to challenge him, depending on what side of the coin you want to land on of his childish responses to the giant. We talked about that last time as well, which really catches us all the way up, because that's about all we got. Chapter 17 was just a giant chapter. Thank you. Thank you. Anyways. So we're going to be in chapter 18. What is the response, the consequence of David slaying Goliath and therefore being credited with the entirety of the rout? All of the death that occurs afterwards, driving the Philistines back into their lands, all of that is going to be credited to David and called David's victory. So in chapter 18, in verse 1, as soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, this is talking about David talking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. Jonathan stripped off his robe from upon himself and gave it to David. He gave David his armor, his sword, his bow, his belt. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war. And this was good in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. So we get a nice little summary statement here of the results. David is welcomed into the entourage of Saul. He's being given royal weapons by Jonathan. He has a deep connection at this point. Their souls are knit together, the way the ESV words it. We're going to get a lot of words to describe their relationship as we go on in the next several chapters. And as a result, David is incredibly successful. He has the Spirit of the Lord on him. He is now the reason why Israel is not destroyed. Remember, I think it's been 2 Sundays ago now. As the Spirit of the Lord leaves Saul, there needs to be a reason why the Spirit of the Lord continues to allow Israel to win. And Immediately, David is thrust into that public scene. So Saul can no longer lead the army successfully. It has to be someone new. David is that someone new. Seemingly, verse 5 may talk about the end of the Philistine campaign. There may have been additional skirmishes and battles. It could also just be a summary statement about what David does. When David goes to war, David wins. Any thoughts before we go a little further? Awesome. In verse 6, as they were coming home, David returned from striking down the Philistine. The women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tambourines and songs of joy and with musical instruments. The women sang to one another as they celebrated, "Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s." Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. He said, "They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom?" And Saul eyed David from that day on. It is not clear whether Saul knows David's anointed. I take the stance he doesn't. I think this is typical king worrying about his own throne kind of stuff going on here. Is that Saul is very concerned. Saul doesn't like the rising young star, knowing the Spirit of the Lord has gone from him. Yes?
It was a hidden thing.
Yeah.
It wasn't public, so I would think they kind of kept it on.
I think so too. I don't think the family, certainly in chapter 8 or 17, I don't think the brothers would have gone around talking about it, just kind of the way that they interacted with David later. Not a very Joseph and his brothers kind of situation between David and his. Any other thoughts anybody has? So David is fast on the rise. It's kind of, this section here is kind of one of the reasons that verse 5 is thought to talk about the continuing Philistine army or onslaught going on, this war, and that David is much more successful, and that's why he continues to be attributed. He is the new rising star. Saul has done great. Really, if you look back at some of the victories you've already had with Saul, Saul has been a very effective commander. His armies have done well in the field, but David's new. And Solomon's going to write about that in Ecclesiastes and a little bit in Proverbs, that people like the new king. They like the new guy. They don't want the old guy anymore. And so David's star is on the rise and Saul's is on the wane. Saul doesn't like it. He very much is upset by this, and this is the beginning of their animosity. Up until this point, Saul and David have gotten along. David's been a good individual in his eyes. He's brought some glory to Saul and his kingdom. He's saved his army. He is playing the lyre in his presence. But at this point, things are definitely going to change. And to prove that point the writer of 1 Samuel is like, let me show you what it looks like when Saul is not happy with somebody. And so in verse 10, the next day, a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre, as he does day by day. Saul had his spear in his hand, and Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David evaded him twice. Okay. Somebody throws a spear at me. I'm not sure I'm going to give them the second opportunity, but David does. I can imagine the flowery language Saul would use. I'm sorry, I didn't know what I meant, and I wasn't meaning to, and an hour later, chucks it again. But that's what happens. As a result of this, though, Saul becomes very afraid of David because the Lord was with him but had departed from Saul. So Saul removed him from his presence, made him a commander of 1,000. He went out and he came in before the people, and David had success in all of his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. And when Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in fearful awe of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before them. Okay, this may also be what verse 5 is talking about. Take it with a grain of salt. We talked about how these stories kind of have some overlap with them in their discussions. Okay. Anybody have any thoughts before we go into David's marriage? Yes.
That Saul keeps sinking lower and lower is that he's not going out really, and he keeps sending David out to do campaigns of war. And the more successful David is, the more Saul sinks, and Saul doesn't realize it, so he keeps putting David higher and higher and higher. So his spirit just keeps sinking and sinking. It's part of God's plan, really, what it is. But Saul doesn't realize it.
Yeah. And Saul is getting older, so it is more of his role to not go out to war. It's very much David with Bathsheba time period. David has been a man of war for a long time at that point, but he's starting to become a statesman more than he is a warrior, just due to age. And Saul seems to be falling into that same trap. He can't go out to battle any longer. It's not really his responsibility. It's not his role. But nobody says, wow, that guy's policies, he's better. Nobody thinks that. Any other thoughts? Yes.
Matt likes to say that when you act out of fear, you bring what you fear on yourself. And that's what I see in this chunk. Saul is terrified that David's going to take power away from him. They are not alone in the throne room when Saul's chucking spears.
Yeah.
So everyone else is saying, Saul's terrified and throwing spears and it keeps missing. Man, that David is really agile. Everybody is watching this play out. And Saul is losing esteem in the eyes of the people, in part because of the way he's acting. He's bringing it on himself because he's terrified that he's going to lose the esteem of the people. Yet that's what his actions do.
Yes. Yes.
Don't you think that even today this is a natural progression of life that people face as they age?
Yeah.
You are replaced.
The next generation.
Stronger, more able, and you are fading, and it is terrifying sometimes.
And like we've talked about, the sad part is Jonathan would have been an awesome king. He really would have. Jonathan and David are of like mind, like character. And so, if Saul had just held it together enough to die, then Jonathan would have been king, and we would have had a very different history coming out of this. But he doesn't, and so Jonathan loses it. But Jonathan's star could have risen just as easily as David's. Any others? Which begs the question, I wonder how Saul would have reacted to Jonathan's star on the rise. But anyways, verse 17. Saul says to David, remember, if you remember back before we read any further, one of the rewards of killing Goliath is you're going to marry into the king's family. And so this is that fulfillment coming up here. So Saul says to David, here is my elder daughter Merab. I will give her to you for a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles. And for Saul thought, let not my hand be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him. And David said to Saul, who am I? And who are my relatives, my father's clan in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king? But at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, she was given to Adriel, the Mahalathite, for a wife. So, we don't know all the details. We don't know why that happened. But for whatever reason, Saul decides not to give his eldest daughter to David. He's going to wind up giving a younger daughter to David. I do want us to look at something, though. If you go to 2 Samuel 21, we do get the end of the story of Merab. She doesn't really play any other role in the rest of David's story. But in 2 Samuel 21, her story comes back in. So it's the end of David's life. There's a lot of trouble going on. In chapter 21, there's a famine that lasts for 3 years. And at that point, David seeks the face of the Lord in verse 1 and learns that there is blood guilt on Saul and on his house because he had put the Gibeonites to death. The Gibeonites then, in their discussion with David, come to the conclusion that something must happen. Something must happen in order to rectify the blood guiltiness. Israel had made a covenant with the Gibeonites. They'd said that they would be spared. They would not be attacked. Saul, in his zeal for Israel and Judah, does try to wipe them out. And so they settle on, let 7 male relatives of Saul be given in order to pay the blood guilt. Down in verse 7, the king spares Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, because of their own arrangement. But then he gathers together several others. In verse 8, he takes the 2 sons of Rizpah, who is concubine to Saul. He also takes the 5 sons of Merab, the daughter of Saul, whom she bore to Adriel, and gave them into the hands of the Gibeonites, and they were hung. Merab doesn't feature in the story. Rizpah goes on. Rizpah is in mourning. She won't let the birds or the animals eat the bodies. And ultimately, David winds up burying all of them, including Saul and Jonathan again. But this is where her story ends. She is given to another man and as a result stays with Saul rather than stays with David. Had Saul given her to David, her children would have been David's, they would not have been Saul's, and they would not have been killed at the end there. So it's just a very interesting ending to the story of Merab. Any thoughts anybody has on that? Okay. So Saul still has a problem. He has made an agreement that he has to still fulfill. A child of his still has to get married to David. Otherwise, he's broken his own word. And so it tells us in verse 20 that there's another daughter. Saul's daughter Michal loved David, and they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. Saul thought, let me give her to him, that she may be a snare for him, and the hand of the Philistines may be against him. So he concocts this plot here. Therefore Saul says to David a second time, you shall be my son-in-law. Saul commands his servants, speak to David in private and say, behold, the king has delight in you, and all his servants love you. Now then become the king's son-in-law. Saul's servant spoke these words in the ears of David, and he says, does it seem to you to be a little thing to be the king's son-in-law, since I'm a poor man and have no reputation? Okay, David, there's humility, and then there's just idiocy. He has a reputation, but anyways. And the servants of Saul told him, thus and so David did speak. Saul said, thus shall you say to David, the king desires no bride price, except 100 foreskins of the Philistines, that he may be avenged of his enemies. Now Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. When his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law. Before the time had expired, David arose and he went along with his men and killed 200 of the Philistines. And David brought their foreskins, which were given in full number to the king, and that he might become the king's son-in-law. Saul gave him his daughter Michal for wife. And when Saul saw that the Lord was pleased with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him, Saul was even more afraid of David. So Saul was David's enemy continually. Then the commanders of the Philistines came out to battle, and as often as they came out, David had more success than all the servants of Saul, so his name was highly esteemed. So David's marriage goes like this. Saul says, I'm going to get him killed. So I'm going to put a bride price of 100 foreskins that have to be Philistines, go out and get them and die. That was his goal. So David and his men go out and they kill 200 of them, and he brings that back as bride price, and he ultimately gets married. Michal's in favor of this one. We're not really told anything about Merab. We don't know if she was excited about marrying David or not. We just get no details about her. But Michal is excited about it. She, in fact, loves David. What is Saul's response to that? Yes. He cannot stop David. Every obstacle he puts in front of David just increases David's reputation. Just increases his standing at court. Just increases now his own standing in the household of Saul. There's just nothing he can do to stop him. Any thoughts before we get into 19?
Yeah, pretty gory scene right there. You know, the detail and the idea of what Saul asked for, and then what David willingly does and decides to do even more than what was requested of him to basically mutilate bodies.
Yeah. Yes, it is an incredibly gory scene. There's a reason David is known as a man of blood. I mean, he has no qualms whatsoever about any bloody situations. Any other thoughts? Cool. 19. So chapter 19, lesson 8, if you've got your lesson and you've been kind of following along, starts our David fleeing Saul era. It's a long section. It goes from 19 really past 21. David's still running, but I ended it at 21. I may have even called the next one David in exile, just because it does seem to be a shift. David goes from running from Saul to David's just gone. And is no longer really a part of Israel. So we'll talk about that shift when we get to it. But in chapter 19, we see some of the reasons why David has to run and where he goes in order to run. So 19 and 20 are going to be that. 21 is going to be the beginning of his leaving. Okay, In 19, in verse 1, Saul speaks to Jonathan his son and all of his servants that they should kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David. And Jonathan told David, Saul, my father, seeks to kill you. Therefore be on your guard in the morning. Stay in a secret place and hide yourself. I'll go out and stand beside my father in the field where you are, and I will speak to my father about you. And if I learn anything, I'll tell you. So Jonathan tries to be a little bit sneaky. Saul says, I can't stand David. He just needs to be gotten rid of. And he tells everybody, anyone who would listen, anybody who is near him, I have the impression that he's just speaking to rooms, and anyone can hear him say David needs to be killed. Jonathan hears of this. He doesn't really believe it. Like, why in the world would this be happening? So he talks to his father about it. In verse 4, he uses the words, let not the king sin against his servant David, because he has not sinned against you, because his deeds have brought good to you. He took his life in his own hand. He struck down the Philistine, and the Lord worked a great salvation for all of Israel. You saw it. You rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood by killing David without cause? And Saul relents. He says, as the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death. Jonathan tells David, and David comes back in before Saul, just like he did previously. But then we have another conflict arise. In verse 8, war comes again. David goes out, he kills a bunch of Philistines, he strikes them down, and a harmful spirit from the Lord comes upon Saul. Why is a harmful spirit of the Lord coming upon Saul? Because David is spoken well of. Anytime there's a war, David does really well. David's star is on the rise, and Saul is angry and fearful. The harmful spirit comes from the Lord comes upon Saul as he sat in his house with his spear in his hand. David's playing the lyre, and Saul seeks to pin David to the wall with the spear. But David eludes Saul so that he struck his spear into the wall, and David fled and escaped that night. I get the impression that this one is much more than just thrown, but like I almost get the impression of he's chasing him here. Like this is hunting at this point. He's not just impulsively chucking a spear across the room. He is hunting David at this stage. And David, rightly so, gets out of Dodge. Any thoughts before we look at where he goes? We get a glimpse in the next section about David's home life. Whether it's David's home life or David's wife's home life, you guys are more than welcome to discuss amongst yourselves. Or you can discuss with me. I mean, that's fine too. But in verse 11, Saul sends messengers to David's house to watch him, to make sure that he's still going to be there, that he can kill him in the morning. Michal says, you got to get out of here. Like, if you stay till morning, he's just going to come and he's going to have you killed. And so Michal lets David down out through the window. He runs away and he escapes. Michal then takes an image, lays it on the bed, and puts a pillow of goat's hair at its head and covers it with clothes. When the messengers come in the morning, she says he's sick. They come in, they see it. It looks like David. And they go back and they tell Saul. Saul says, carry the bed. Bring that whole bed to me. And that's when they discover that, in fact, it's an image. It is not David. Saul accuses Michal in verse 17, why have you deceived me thus and let my enemy go so that he has escaped? And Michal says, he told me, let me go. Why should I kill you? And so she blames it on David. It's probably smart. Let's just be honest. If she took credit for it, I imagine there's a spear in Saul's hand, and that may not have ended very well for her. But we get a little glimpse into the religion of Israel here. What did she use in the bed? She used an image, which is probably an idol. I doubt it's decoration. That's not the way 1 Samuel ever reads when it uses the word image. Like, nobody says, it's a great statue of David. No, that's not what it is. It's an image. It's an idol. It's a household idol. It's larger than average. If you have a household idol, they tend to be like 12 inches, maybe as much as 2 feet. This one's the size of a dude. Like, it's enough that you can convince that David is lying in the bed. So it's prominent, it's wealth, it's importance, and David doesn't get rid of it. We think of David as a man of God. David, the man of God, has a household idol in his home and he doesn't remove it. That is the reality of 1 Samuel's religion. We hold to a certain standard. We're Christians, we hold a certain way. We can't really apply our standard to 1 Samuel because it wasn't the world they lived in. They don't really have a tabernacle at this point. There's a chance it was destroyed at Shiloh because the next time that we see them talk about any priestly things, they're just in a house. They're not at a tabernacle. They don't have the Ark of the Covenant. It's still in one of the towns in Judah. They have an ephod, but they don't necessarily have somebody wearing the ephod. We're going to see that later on in chapter 21. We'll see that. So the religion in Israel is chaotic. God is God, but so are all of the others. Which one stands up above the rest? Does David worship this other God? I can't answer that one, but it's in his house. Any thoughts anybody has? It's very interesting to me that really, since Samuel walked freely, really since before Eli, they have not held firmly to law of Moses. Samuel held them to don't offer a sacrifice unless I come. Like that's kind of where Samuel held them. But even he does not hold them to the law of Moses. Yes?
When Laban tracks down Jacob and his wife, is it Rachel that sits on the household gods?
Yeah.
So they were very small. And but this one is 4.5, 5 foot, tall. That's something that's kind of hard to hide.
Yes. It would have been very prominent. Yes. Whereas typically it would have been on a little table. There's just a handful of them with something for incense. Would have been very typical scene. This is much larger. Makes you wonder, how many others did they have? Yes. Any other thoughts anybody has?
Well, and we read, every man did what was right in his own eyes. And we think, well, but, some of them are going to do what God says to do because they're decent. And that's probably expecting too much.
Yeah.
That it is real easy to deceive yourself into saying, well, it's fine. It's God is fine with this. To the point where even a man after God's own heart has a giant idol in his house.
Yes. Yes. And to be fair, how many copies of the law of Moses are there? One? Maybe a couple others, but we don't really get the impression that they copied it very much. How many copies are available to lay people? 0. So your reliance entirely upon priests. There's not very many priests. There's going to be fewer priests after chapter 22.
There is a provision, though, in the law that it is supposed to be whitewashed on the walls of the cities.
True. Maybe if you lived in a city then. But yes, like they're supposed to write it on doorposts. Like it's always supposed to be in front of them. However, we don't get any impression of that in 1 Samuel. Not once. Any other thoughts anybody has? I kind of think about it like lower Middle Ages. You're lucky if your local Roman Catholic Church had a gospel. And then you're trying to follow God only after a gospel. John seemed to be very popular. So you have the Gospel of John, and you're going to try to be a Christian following the Gospel of John, and that's all you've got. It's very difficult. So maybe you have a priest that can help you. Maybe you have a Levite that knows. Maybe you're lucky enough to live in a city that actually put it on the wall. But knowing the law is hard. Charlie.
It just makes me think how thankful I am that God has patience. Because how in the world do you put up with all this stuff? And done so many things for them, and continually. And it's the same thing today. I mean, he has patience with us, we're all sinners. But we're just so grateful, or I'm so grateful that he has patience with me, because I still sin. But I don't have no idols in my house, as far as I know.
Yeah.
And it's just amazing how this continually happens for hundreds and hundreds of years. And I can see why one time he said, let me wipe them out and start all over again. I can see why he can say it today. Let me start all over again. Let's get rid of the people here. And we don't want that.
And we really see grace of God in the Old Testament with that. How someone like David is still considered righteous. We consider him righteous. The New Testament considers him righteous all over the place. And having a household idol early on in his life, in his home. And a lot of the things he's going to do in 2 Samuel are not very righteous. But the grace of God is still extended to him. Yeah. It gives us hope. Like, really, let's be honest. That gives me a lot of hope. Because if somebody like David, that we've got all of these wrong things written about, can be considered righteous, then surely we can do it. Yeah. Any other thoughts anybody has? Good comments. I knew that one would get you guys going. Yes.
When you read through the Old Testament, you find pockets where people didn't know God at all.
Yeah.
But then they find out what God wants them to do. He didn't punish those people, he got the next generation. I didn't understand that, but he didn't tell them, I'm not going to get you, but but your next 2 generations, I'm going to punish them.
Yeah.
But he still looked after them.
He does. So the comment here is, there are whole generations. You think about like Manasseh's generation leading up to Josiah is a great example of that, where God doesn't punish, but he punishes the later generations. And usually he punishes the later generations after they've come back to him. So then they know what's going on and they know why it's happening. If he just punishes somebody who has no idea, they don't really know. It doesn't do a lot of good, which is funny to think.
They found the book of the law in the treasury. They did everything he said do ever, but they still got it.
Yeah.
They got it. Wow.
All right, let's get a little further here. Where does David go? Down in verse 18 of chapter 19. David flees, he escapes, he goes up to Ramah. So if you're looking at your map up here, we've got Gibeon of Saul. Come on, there you go. Gibeon of Saul right here. Remember, Saul primarily is king over Benjamin. Ramah's up in this region, so somewhere between there and Shiloh. So that's where he's going. He's just fleeing. He's not fleeing very far. He's just trying to get out of town. So David goes up there. The reason he goes up there is because nearby at the town of Naioth is Samuel. He goes and he speaks with Samuel. Saul is told that's where David is. Saul sends messengers to take David, but as they get nearby and they see the company of prophets and Samuel standing over them and the prophecies are going on, the Spirit of God comes upon them and they prophesy. That's just got to be a wild, wild moment, right? You're coming to take this guy who is an enemy of the state, and then you prophesy. And I want to know what they were told. Like, were they just told the reality of the situation? That alone would be awe-inspiring. If nothing more than they start saying, the Spirit of the Lord has left Saul because Saul did not obey the command of God. That is a prophecy. And then they got to go home and they got to tell people that. Like, it's astounding. Saul sends messengers. He sends another wave of messengers. He sends another wave of messengers. All of them prophesy when they get close. It's a little bit of Elijah throwing fire down on a bunch of people. Until ultimately he comes himself. When he gets there, though, the same thing happens to him, except that in verse 24, it says that he strips off his clothes while he prophesies. He lies naked all day and all night, prostrated before Samuel. So much so that for the second time in his life, people start to say, wait a second, is Saul among the prophets? It's kind of funny. The punishment of God upon Saul actually improves the reputation of Saul. That he is so righteous, he's also amongst the prophets. So very interesting. Any comments anybody has? Okay. David's not going to stay with Samuel for very long. In chapter 20 and verse 1, he flees from there, and he comes back down to talk to Jonathan. He doesn't really know what he's doing. He left home abruptly. He doesn't have his things with him. He doesn't have any of his stuff or his people with him. He himself just fled and ran away up to Samuel, and Samuel clearly did not give him a great answer. If you think about Samuel and the prophets prophesying, what kind of things would they say to David here? Clearly he did not get good news because he comes right back down to Jonathan and he's like, I still don't know what I've done. So Samuel doesn't tell him a lot of truths. The prophets don't tell him a lot of truths. He's still left very much in the dark. What have I done? What is my guilt? What is my sin before your father that he seeks my life? Jonathan tries to smooth it out. Look at his comments here in verse 2. Far from it, you shall not die. Behold, my father does nothing, either great or small, without disclosing it to me. Why should my father hide this from me? It is not so. Clearly, some time has passed. That's my favorite Old Testament phrase. Some time has passed. How much? I don't know. But it's been a little while since the last time that Jonathan and his father talked about this. So we don't get the impression that Jonathan really knows that these messengers have been sent to go and get David. He may not fully even understand what happened at the house of Michal. So to him, it almost sounds like he thinks David's overreacting. Yeah, my dad's mad, but it's not going to be that bad. He'd have told me if we're hunting you again. And he hasn't told me that, so clearly we're okay. So, go a little further. David's like, no, this is real. Your father knows well that I have found favor in your eyes, and he thinks, do not let Jonathan know this, lest he be grieved. But truly as the Lord lives, as your soul lives, there is but a step between me and death. Jonathan says, whatever you say, I'm going to do. And David says, you need to figure this out. We've got a feast that's coming up. I'm supposed to be sitting there. I know that he's going to be there. I know that his spear is going to be there. And I know that I'm within striking range. I don't want to go. David, the man who has no problem whatsoever standing in front of an army, doesn't want to go to a feast. You want to talk about frightened. That is frightened. So he says, make an excuse for me. Say that David needed to go back to Bethlehem because they're having a yearly sacrifice. He wanted to go be with his family. Say whatever you feel like saying. I'm not going. So Jonathan does this. During the feast, we see Saul kind of has his, well, we got a little bit before that, I suppose. Jonathan and David make a covenant with each other, verse 12 down through verse 17. Covenant really just boils down to Saul is your enemy. There's no way around it, but I'm not your enemy. So make a covenant with me that when God kills all of your enemies, you remember I'm not your enemy. That's going back to chapter 21 of 2 Samuel. We see him still keeping that same vow, that he protects Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, to keep his vow with his friend. Okay. Down in verse 26, let's drop on down there. The feast is happening. Saul says to himself, something must have happened to him. He's not here. He must be not clean. Thinking back to your Leviticus class and the amazing teacher that you had that taught you Leviticus, what are some of the things that could have happened that would have made him unclean for one day? Touching dead things. Okay, what is David's job? Like, if he walked out in the countryside, saw a Philistine, and killed him, he's unclean. He can't come to the feast. This feast probably is peace offerings. They're eating with God because it's the new moon. So he can't. It's holy. So that's one of the things. What's something else that could have happened? Thank you. Yes. Sexual intercourse can make you unclean for the rest of that day. That's why I wanted someone to say it. So true, yes, because that's going to come right up here in just a minute. Though why they single that one out, we can talk about when we get to chapter 21. We're not getting ahead of ourselves. But you're right. What's something else? I can think of at least one more. Probably if I tried really hard, I could think of more, but we're going to go with just, give me one more. What makes somebody unclean for a day? What about touching an unclean animal? Several insects fall into that category. Small lizards fall into that category. There's a whole section in Leviticus like, what do you do if a lizard falls on your flour? It's unclean. Throw it out. What if it falls in your pot? It's unclean. If it's brass, then you clean it. If it's not, you break it. So you got to be really careful with that. So maybe all it is that he encountered some animal that he wasn't supposed to be touching. He's unclean until evening. So these three things are just everyday life for David. He's married, he's a warrior, he lives in the world and encounters unclean animals, probably pretty frequently. So, Saul can excuse him. It happens. You get unclean, it happens. Yes.
So he has a life-size idol in his house, but is concerned about being clean or unclean.
Yeah.
Why would they have picked that to... I mean, they don't care what God thinks.
Why does it seem like the tithe is the most important thing in the New Testament? Why is that the one that seems to be picked? Yeah, you're right. They pick and choose. Pick and choose. Okay. So he excuses him day one because he's like, okay, something happened. He's not clean. He can't come. Day two, however, he should be clean. So, day one, at the end of day, he washes himself ritually, just like they taught in Leviticus. The next day, he's clean. He stays home. He doesn't go anywhere. He's not going out to war. He doesn't sleep with his wife. He stays clean. He should be at the feast. He knows it's coming. But he doesn't show. David does not show. So Saul asks Jonathan, where is he? I don't see him today. I didn't see him yesterday. Jonathan tells the lie. He says, David asked to go to Bethlehem. I said it was okay. He could go. What's Saul's response? What's he do? He's angry. He yells at Jonathan. He curses Jonathan's mother. Thank you. And then what does he do? Verse 33. He tried to kill him with a spear. That's his go-to move. Evidently, he's got that spear locked and ready. I want to know if he did it to other people. Like, I want to know if that was a common occurrence. Like, you had this chance, like, going before the kings of the Persians. If they don't, put out the scepter, then you get killed. I wonder if that was like a Saul thing. Like, I don't really want to deal with the peasant little problems today, so I killed you instead. I just want to know. But we're not told. But yeah, he tries to kill his own son in his rage and in his fear of David. And so Jonathan leaves. I love that. In verse 33, Saul hurled his spear to strike him. So Jonathan knew his father was determined to put David to death. Like, it's just so matter of fact. Jonathan, I love the writer of 1 Samuel because sometimes his humor is just so funny. And that's one of those moments. Jonathan rises from the table in fierce anger. He eats no food the second day of the month, for he was grieved for David because his father had disgraced him. I just love the whole image there. Like, Jonathan, he doesn't necessarily care. Like, he's ticked off because Saul wants to kill David. Saul tried to kill him, and I just get this image of Jonathan just be like, and leaves in anger. Like, he just moves. Anyways, any thoughts anybody has? Yes.
I'll grab you just a second. She was first. No, you got to get my attention because you're in the corner. I can't always see you. But you're second. Yes.
I know we had discussed that possibly people didn't know David was to become king, but something here has always made me think that Saul did know because he's trying to thwart God's plan. He says, Jonathan, don't you understand? If this man lives, you don't get the kingdom.
Yeah.
So there is something somewhere that has, and maybe it wasn't in the beginning, maybe it was more secretive in the beginning, but somewhere along the line, I think Saul knows what God's will is.
Or just responding to a rising star. Yes. That threat to a kingship, but yeah.
I think that Saul knew somehow and was trying to thwart God's plan.
Yeah. Landon?
Interesting, when Saul lashes out against Jonathan in anger, he attacks Jonathan's mother. What else do we know about Jonathan's mother?
Not as far as I know, this is it.
Unless you know of another verse. Because, yeah, I don't know of another one. This is it. Yeah. Yes.
No.
Okay.
Which one?
The phrase, to the shame of your mother's nakedness.
Do I want?
To comment on it?
In homosexual apologetics, Jonathan is seen as, and David are seen as having a homosexual relationship.
Yeah.
And from this passage and from the other passage that he loved him more than a woman. And their souls were knit together. And it's so pervasive that you remember back in the late 2000s, NBC had a series called Kings. Did you ever see? So it was a kind of a modern adaptation of the story of David and Saul and Jonathan. And the Jonathan figure in that series is unapologetically homosexual because they're picking up on this. So this is a passage that's used very heavily to try to prove that.
Okay.
Yeah. The way I viewed it is similar passages that talk about when a parent's nakedness is revealed. Like, God uses it pretty frequently to describe revealing the nakedness of Israel or something like that. Is that the sexual encounter itself was shameful. So Saul, it almost sounds like, is blaming his own encounter with the mother of Jonathan as being shameful, rather than necessarily attacking Jonathan directly, which kind of makes you wonder if, is she a concubine? Is she a prostitute? Like, is she a full wife? There may be even some comments about that. Yeah. And I saw other hands. I don't know if you were scratching an itch or yes.
As far as people thinking this was a homosexual relationship, I think if it was, God would have told us right out, because he doesn't cover up anything. He doesn't leave anything, he just tells it. So I think if they really were, then it would have been spoken.
And that's not a sin that God tends to overlook very long. I don't think that we would know Jesus as the son of David had that sin been there. There can be a lot of sin, but that one tends to not be included. As far as God overlooking, he tends to not overlook it. So yeah, I don't really see it. I can see why they think it. It's there. And especially with a culture like we have, that a man and another man can only love each other in one way. You can be, well, I guess two ways. You can be distant friends, or you're homosexual. And there is no in between. Whereas in the ancient world, that just wasn't there. Like, they had so much variety and so many levels to love in those kind of relationships that this is very acceptable in the ancient world, where today it would be much more difficult because our culture doesn't allow it. Anything else? Yes.
What do you know off the top of your head is the age difference between Jonathan and David?
Maybe. Move that back. Or forward, whichever way. Thank you. Okay. So Jonathan's born about 1052. David kills Goliath about 1024. What is that, a 27 or so year difference? Is that right? 28, thank you. David's probably a late teen. So to use easy numbers, we'll say David's 17. Or even if David being 18, he puts him at a 10-year difference. Yeah. 10 to 15 years, depending upon how you want to age them from that point. And these are guesses. Obviously, Jonathan's age is a guess based upon other numbers that we get. But that seems to be about right, especially with him, his father becoming king, and him being old enough to be in the military, but young enough to still be alive long after that time period. So yeah. So that's my best answer. 10 to 15 years.
I think we usually think of them as the same age, so it's a little bit different image.
Yes, yes. Like we think of the apostles as being, 45 years old when walking with Jesus, and they're clearly younger than Jesus. Any other comments? I don't see anybody else. Okay, we got about 5 minutes. Let's finish off this chapter. Verse 35. In the morning, Jonathan comes out to the field. They do their agreed upon method of interacting with each other. So Jonathan has this really elaborate, I'm going to shoot some arrows, I'm going to say this thing to the boy, and if it's one phrase, then this, and one phrase, then that. So they go through the whole elaborate thing. And I believe, if I understood it correctly, Jonathan is supposed to leave. He's not supposed to stay and talk to David. But again, this is how close their relationship is that this potentially could be the last time, from their perspective, not from our perspective, but from their perspective, this could be the last time they ever see each other. And so Jonathan is not content to just shoot some arrows in the field and give David a message to run away. He sends the boy back to the city with the arrows and with the bow, and Jonathan stays in order to see David. In verse 41, as soon as the boy had gone, David rises from behind the stone heap. He falls on his face to the ground. He bows 3 times. They kiss one another. They weep with one another. David weeps the most. And Jonathan says to David, "Go in peace, because we have sworn, both of us, in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord shall be between me and you, and between my offspring and your offspring forever." And he rose, he departed, and Jonathan went into the city. So David and Jonathan are distraught here, because potentially this is the last time that they'll ever see each other. Saul does not seem to be relenting. David can't come back to court. Jonathan certainly can't run off into the wilderness. He's the son of Saul. He's in line for the throne. He has responsibilities of his own. And so this may be the end. Chapter 21 starts David running away into exile and not coming back to court. The next time he's going to come back to court will be after Saul's death. Any comments anybody has? Yes. And then yes.
He knows in his heart that he's not good. And you don't see him plotting to do so.
I imagine
David would have told him to. Going back to the early comment of it, the announcement of his anointing getting out, I can't imagine David keeping that secret from Jonathan. Yes?
Offspring, so they're going to be with women.
yes. Yes. Ancient world did not
Have hard and fast homosexuality like we do in our culture. And so it was, to go back to Clay's comment, that's not necessarily going to fight that argument. Bisexuality was much more the norm for the ancient world, but you're right. Like, they're not talking about being with each other anywhere. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Yes.
David could have easily, it seems like, taken over from Saul at this point, even, several years before, because Saul was acting crazy, everybody was, backing David more than Saul, and I think if he had wanted to, he could have killed Saul and been like, look, God has made me king, and that kind of thing. And so we know later on he's not going to do that, but even before, he's still respecting. You were talking about when he was afraid to go to the feast. I think it's not because he was afraid of being killed, but he was not going to overstep as far as like defending himself or Saul.
That's a good comment. The comment is that David does not seem to be grasping for kingship, but seems to be allowing that process to go on, but he very well could have grasped at kingship at this point. Okay. So we're going to pick up with chapter 21 next time, getting into lesson 9 with 22 and 23. So you're welcome to read ahead and prepare for those. Thank you very much for your attention.